All right, let me tell you about a night that still wakes me up sometimes. Even now, years later, when I hear water slap against a wooden dock in the dark, I feel the same cold weight settle in my chest. I've spent most of my life guiding people along wild rivers, showing tourists animals, teaching them how to read currents, how to respect the water. By the time I turned 42, I thought I understood every danger a river could throw at a man. Crocodiles, sudden storms, capsizing boats. I'd handled it all. But that night taught me something about the river that no amount of experience had prepared me for. It happened along a wide stretch of slow-moving water in East Africa. I'd been guiding for almost 15 years in that region, running small night trips for travelers who wanted to hear the jungle after sunset. The river changes at night. During the day, it looks calm, almost lazy, reflecting the sky like polished glass. But after dark, the entire place feels alive, in a different way. Like something ancient wakes up when the sun disappears. That evening had been quiet. Too quiet, actually. I remember noticing it while we pushed the boat off the muddy bank just after sunset. Usually by that time the air is buzzing with insects and the distant calls of birds settling in. But that night there was a strange stillness. The sky was thick with low clouds, trapping the heat from the day. The air smelled heavy. Mud, wet leaves, and that faint, sour scent that comes from stagnant water. I had 3 tourists with me, a young couple from Germany and an older man from Canada who had been photographing wildlife all week. They were excited, whispering to each other as we drifted into the darker section of the river where the trees leaned over the water like long, crooked fingers. The motor on my small aluminum boat hummed softly while I guided us through the slow current. My spotlight swept across the banks, occasionally catching glowing reflections in the darkness, pairs of eyes belonging to crocodiles resting near the shoreline. The tourists gasped quietly every time they saw them, but crocodiles weren't what worried me that night. Hippos lived in that stretch of river too. Now, if you've never been near a wild hippopotamus, you might think they're slow or clumsy. They look almost cartoonish in daylight. Big round bodies, small ears flicking at flies. But the truth is, hippos are one of the most dangerous animals on Earth. They're territorial, aggressive, and unbelievably fast in water. A full-grown bull can flip a boat like it's a toy, and they hate being surprised. I knew where most of the hippos usually stayed, a shallow lagoon a mile downstream. That's why we were drifting slowly along a different channel, one I'd used many times before, without trouble. Still, I kept the engine low and listened carefully. On a river at night, sound tells you everything. For a long time, all I heard was the gentle slap of water against the hull and the occasional chirp of insects. The beam of my spotlight moved across tall reeds, swaying along the banks. Then we heard it, a low grunt. It was deep, almost like someone dragging a heavy log across wet sand. The sound rolled across the water and faded into the darkness. I froze. The tourists looked at me, confused. "Was that a hippo?" the Canadian man asked quietly. I nodded, but inside something tightened in my stomach. The sound hadn't come from the lagoon. It came from somewhere very close. I slowly cut the engine. The river went silent. When a motor stops in the jungle at night, the quiet feels almost unnatural. Suddenly, you notice every tiny sound, the rustle of leaves, the splash of something small diving into the water, the slow rhythm of your own breathing. We drifted for a moment. Then another sound echoed across the water. This one was louder. A deep, explosive snort, followed by the splash of something massive moving beneath the surface. My heart started beating faster. Hippos spend most of the night grazing on land, but sometimes a lone bull stays in the water guarding territory. And if our boat had drifted into that territory without us realizing, well, that's when things get dangerous. I slowly raised the spotlight and scanned the river. For a moment I saw nothing but black water. Then two small, rounded shapes appeared just above the surface about 30 yards ahead of us. Eyes and tiny ears twitching. The hippo's head was barely visible, but I knew the rest of its massive body was floating just beneath the surface, like a submerged boulder. One of the tourists whispered nervously, "Is it going to attack?" I forced a calm smile, though inside my mind was already calculating distances, currents, and escape routes. "Not if we move slowly," I said quietly. "That's the rule with hippos. Never panic, never startle them." I gently restarted the engine at the lowest possible speed and began turning the boat away from where the animal floated. The idea was simple. Give it space and drift downstream until we were far enough away. For a few seconds it seemed like it would work. The hippo stayed still, watching us. Then the water around its head began to ripple, and suddenly it disappeared beneath the surface. Every muscle in my body went tight, because when a hippo goes underwater, you don't know where it will come up. I pushed the throttle a little harder, trying to move us away faster. The engine hummed louder, and the boat picked up speed. But the river around us looked empty, too empty. The tourists were silent now. They sensed the tension even if they didn't fully understand it. We had moved maybe 20 yards when the water beside the boat exploded. A massive gray shape erupted from the river like a living torpedo. The hippo's head was enormous, its mouth wide open, showing huge yellow tusks that looked like curved daggers. It slammed into the side of the boat with a force that threw me sideways. The entire boat rocked violently. One of the tourists screamed. The hippo disappeared again beneath the water. "Hold on!" I shouted. I slammed the throttle forward, trying to outrun it, but deep down I knew something terrifying. Hippos can swim faster than boats in short bursts. The water behind us surged. Then the animal hit us again. This time the impact lifted one side of the boat almost completely out of the water. The engine screamed while the propeller spun uselessly in the air. The Canadian photographer lost his balance and crashed against the side railing. The hippo surfaced again directly beside us. I will never forget that moment. The spotlight beam caught its face perfectly. Its jaws opened wider than I thought possible, pink flesh stretching around those massive tusks. Then it lunged. Its mouth clamped onto the edge of the boat with a sickening crunch of bending metal. The entire hull groaned. I realized right then that if the hippo rolled or bit harder, the boat would split open, and we'd all be in the water with it. I grabbed the emergency flare gun mounted near the steering console. Hippos rely heavily on vision and sound when they attack. Sudden bright light and noise can sometimes shock them long enough to escape. Sometimes. My hands were shaking as I aimed the flare directly at the animal's head. "Close your eyes," I shouted. I pulled the trigger. The flare exploded in a blinding burst of red light and sparks inches above the hippo's face. For a split second, the animal hesitated. Then, it released the boat with a violent splash and sank back into the dark water. I didn't wait. I slammed the throttle all the way forward. The engine roared and the boat shot down the river, bouncing across the surface, while my heart hammered in my chest. For several seconds I expected another impact from below, but none came. The river behind us stayed dark and still. Eventually, the shoreline lights from the small camp appeared in the distance. Only then did I finally slow the boat. My hands were still shaking. The tourists sat in stunned silence, their faces pale under the moonlight that had finally broken through the clouds. When we reached the dock, none of us spoke for a long moment. Later that night, after everyone had gone to their cabins, I walked back down to the river alone. The water looked peaceful again, almost innocent. But I knew better. That night reminded me of something every river guide eventually learns. Out there, in the wild, you're never really in control. You're just a visitor moving through someone else's territory. And sometimes the river decides to remind you of that in the most violent way possible.